In 1939, Europe was holding its breath. After Germany casually annexed Poland, the continent's other landlords, Britain and France, declared war. Then, for 8 straight months, absolutely nothing happened. This period of intense staring was charitably called the Phony War. The French felt pretty secure, you see. They had spent a fortune, about 3 billion francs, on a series of underground fortresses called the Maginot Line. It was a masterpiece of concrete, tunnels, and artillery, with air conditioning and underground railways. A truly spectacular achievement in military engineering, designed to fight the last war perfectly. It had just one tiny, insignificant flaw. It didn't cover the border with Belgium, specifically the bit with the Ardennes forest. Because who would be crazy enough to drive a tank through a forest? An absolutely preposterous idea. The man in charge of the Allied armies was Maurice Gamelin. Gamelin was the personification of looks good on paper. He operated from a command post at Vincennes, which, in a stroke of genius, had no telephone or radio links to his armies in the field. He preferred to communicate via motorcycle courier. Yes, in 1940. His grand strategy, the Dial Plan, involved rushing the best Allied armies into Belgium to meet the Germans there. This plan assumed the Germans would do exactly what they did in 1914. It's a bold strategy to assume your enemy hasn't had a single new idea in 25 years. Meanwhile, the French doctrine treated tanks not as spearheads, but as infantry support. They had more tanks than the Germans, and some were objectively better, like the Char B-1 bis. But they were scattered among infantry divisions like armored pepper, instead of concentrated into a fist. The Germans' initial plan, Fall Gelb or Case Yellow, was hilariously almost exactly what the Allies expected. A boring, unimaginative repeat of the old Schlieffen Plan. Then, on January 10, 1940, a German officer carrying the plans got lost in fog and crash-landed in Belgium. The Belgians found the partially burned documents, and suddenly the German playbook was open to everyone. This should have been a disaster for Germany. Instead, it was the best thing that could have happened. It forced them to listen to a guy named Erich von Manstein, who had a much spicier idea. He proposed a Sickelschnitt, or sickle cut. Lure the Allies into Belgium, just as they planned, and then punch the main armored force through the impassable Ardennes, cutting them off from behind. The German High Command thought it was reckless. A certain German leader with a notable mustache, however, thought it sounded brilliant. On May 10, 1940, the attack began. The Germans slammed into the Netherlands and Belgium, and the Allies, bless their hearts, reacted exactly as predicted. The British Expeditionary Force and the best French armies charged north to meet them, leaving their southern flank swinging in the breeze. Meanwhile, Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was navigating the world's most stressful camping trip through the Ardennes. Over 1,500 tanks and 134,000 men were crammed onto a few narrow, winding forest roads. It created a traffic jam nearly 250 kilometers long. If Allied air reconnaissance had spotted this giant metal snake, they could have obliterated the entire German offensive. But French aerial reconnaissance was busy, counting trees. They saw some tanks, reported them, and were basically told it was impossible and they must be mistaken. Confirmation bias is a powerful thing. By May 13th, Guderian's tanks emerged from the forest, much to the surprise of the French reservists guarding the Meuse River at Sedan. These were not elite troops. They were mostly older soldiers with second-rate equipment. They were not expecting a panzer army to appear out of the woods. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, played a key role here. Hundreds of Stuka dive bombers, fitted with terrifying Jericho trumpet sirens, screamed down on the French positions. The bombing wasn't exceptionally destructive, but the psychological effect was devastating. It shattered morale. The French artillery, which was actually quite good, was paralyzed by the constant aerial attacks and the sheer shock. German combat engineers crossed the river in rubber boats under fire, and by nightfall they had a bridgehead. The defensive line, which was supposed to hold for days, had been cracked open in a matter of hours. Once across the Meuse, Heinz Guderian did something that terrified his own superiors. He kept going. The plan was to pause and consolidate the bridgehead. Guderian saw a gaping hole and decided to drive a panzer army through it. His commander, von Kleist, ordered him to halt. Guderian basically threatened to resign. They reached a comical compromise. He was allowed to conduct a reconnaissance in force, but couldn't move his headquarters. So Guderian just drove off with his command tank and radio, leaving his formal HQ behind while leading the charge to the English Channel. This was Blitzkrieg in action. Not a carefully orchestrated plan, but a philosophy of exploiting success with relentless speed, often against direct orders. The Allied command structure simply couldn't process information this quickly. By the time they figured out where Guderian was, he was already 50 miles further west. The speed of the German advance created something called command paralysis. French generals were issuing orders to divisions that had already ceased to exist. Communications were a disaster. Telephone lines were cut, and motorcycle couriers couldn't find anyone to deliver messages to. Rumors spread faster than the panzers. Tales of unstoppable German tanks and endless waves of paratroopers, most of them false, crippled the will to fight. For the average French soldier, the experience was one of utter chaos. One moment they were waiting for a fight, the next they were being told to retreat from an enemy they hadn't even seen yet. Entire armies dissolved. It wasn't that the French soldier was cowardly, it was that the system designed to support him had evaporated in 72 hours. It's hard to fight bravely when your officers have vanished and you're being strafed by planes you were told couldn't get through. It wasn't all a one-sided disaster. There were moments of fierce resistance. At the Battle of Stone, French and German tanks fought a brutal, seesaw battle for a tiny village for 3 days. The town changed hands 17 times. A single French Char B-1 Bice tank, the commanded by Captain Pierre Biot, single-handedly attacked a column of German tanks, destroying 13 of them without taking any serious damage. The Germans nicknamed the tank a behemoth. And at Arras, a British counterattack with Matilda tanks briefly spooked the German high command, including Rommel himself. The Matilda's armor was so thick that German anti-tank guns just bounced off. But these were isolated incidents. They were like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The strategic situation was so utterly broken that tactical victories were meaningless. They were just heroic footnotes in a story of catastrophic failure. By May 20th, Guderian's tanks reached the English Channel, completing the sickle cut. The main Allied armies were now completely trapped in Belgium, their supply lines severed. Their only hope was the sea. This led to the famous evacuation at Dunkirk. But here's the weird part. The German tanks stopped. The halt order of May 24th is one of history's great debates. Was it the German leader wanting to let the British go? Was it Goering wanting the Luftwaffe to get the glory? Or was it simply the German commanders being terrified their tanks had overextended and were vulnerable to a counterattack? Whatever the reason, this pause allowed the Allies to organize a desperate, improvised evacuation, using everything from warships to fishing boats. They rescued over 338,000 soldiers who would live to fight another day. It was a miracle born from a catastrophe, a victory snatched from the jaws of total annihilation, which itself was snatched from the jaws of comprehensive incompetence. With the British Army gone, the fate of France was sealed. The remaining French forces fought on, but it was hopeless. The Germans launched Case Red, the second phase of their plan, and swept south. On June 14th, German troops entered an undefended, eerily quiet Paris. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. To add a bit of historical salt to the wound, the signing was held in the exact same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Classy. In just 6 weeks, an army thought to be the most powerful in the world had been utterly humiliated. It wasn't a failure of soldiers or technology, but a failure of imagination. A failure to believe the enemy could be so audacious, and a failure to adapt when the unbelievable happened right in front of your face. It stands as one of history's most stunning examples of what happens when you prepare brilliantly for a war that is never going to be fought again. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!